But are we about to hear all about red teaming? Is it about to teach us how to break into computers? I'm excited about that
He's
part.
already red teaming us. We
Right.
just don't.
We're gonna make you a presenter, Cedric.
Looking forward to it. And Wolfgang, great talk. A lot of good points. So I look forward to talking about those as well.
Thank you, sir. I'm looking forward to yours. I will drop off video then and mute.
All right, can you all see the screen okay?
The floor is yours.
All right, sounds good. Well, thank you to the GRIMMCon team for, GRIMMCon team for having me. It's been a long morning. GRIMMCon team for having me. Super excited to be here. I'm Cedric Owens, and I'll be talking through building effective red team functions as an internal corporate security red teams here in 2021. So a little bit of background information on myself. I'm currently the red team lead at Twilio, and personally, I enjoy kind of two areas that I like to play with in my personal time. I enjoy macOS, post-exploitation, and infrastructure automation. So usually if I have free time on weekends and I have side projects, usually building something in one of those two buckets. Been blessed to be a husband and father to a wonderful wife and kids, and currently reside here in Austin, though I'm actually from, all of us in the family are from the East Coast. We've been here for about 3.5 years. The photo here is actually from the highest, what I believe is the highest point in Austin, Mount Vanell. So pretty cool area. Did good hiking there with the kids. But prior to red team, I used to actually be blue team, and that's sort of where in the Intel community, I fell into being like a packet analyst all the way over through incident response in the private sector. And for me, something that Wolfgang really spoke on about empathy, that's sort of why I have a heart for blue teams, and because I've actually worked the role and I understand the challenges associated with blue teaming effectively today. But I really do enjoy collaborating with blue teams, with purple team exercises, and just helping uplift the overall detection and response posture. This time here at Twilio, this is actually my second time building out a corporate red team function. In both instances, I was able to be the first, basically I was the first person, I was a one-person red team show, sort of with the open question of, hey, like what is a red team? What does it do? Should we invest in it, etc.? And in both instances, I was able to grow the team with additional headcount and resources. So I hope that some of the things I've learned along the way will actually be of help or benefit to those who are looking to do similar things. I'm also a fan of 80s and early 90s. The music, the food, the movies, all that stuff is good with us. Me and my wife, we just kind of love looking back at nostalgic stuff. So it's a good chance you may see some memes pop up that reflect those decades throughout my presentation. And I am on Twitter at Ced Owens, so occasionally I'll post things from time to time there that may be of interest. So agenda, I plan to talk through, from my perspective, what the state of the union is right now in terms of like a shift towards internal red teams at corporations. Some ground level foundational things to think about as like if you're going to build out a red team program, some general guidelines and approaches that you can use, some pretty practical approaches around running red team exercises. Some things around, some considerations around your roadmap, how important the roadmap is, how to plan it, workflow, your workflow around that. Some meaningful metrics and lessons learned. So let's jump into the State of the Union. So I remember initially when I fell into security many years back, it was kind of interesting for me to see the shift between then and now, because back then it was more like you had network admins or sysadmins that basically had their normal day-to-day job, and then they would also roll in security things like configuring firewalls or responding to intrusion attempts, things like that. So at that time, the security field, so to speak, was more generalized outside of the federal sector. And it's been interesting kind of watching things evolve over time, where like eventually you saw companies like GE and Mandiant in the forefront sort of defining what a security operations center and incident response team look like and what the workflows look like, and started really standardizing those teams. And kind of fast forward to today, and corporate internal red teams are still kind of like the new kid on the block, along with things like insider threat. Just trying to figure out, like, how do these new teams fit into an organization? What do we do? There's really not many standards since it's pretty new, and we're all sort of learning from each other. Those of us that are doing internal corporate red team, we're kind of building and trying things and seeing what sticks and works in our environment. So hopefully from this talk, I'll share some things that I've learned, and hopefully you'll find them useful in your organization as well. So some foundational ground level things. First key assumption, if you're looking to start an internal red team, would be that there is a blue team there, as in there's a security operations center and incident response function there, that the team has the ability to see at least some visibility in the environment and the ability to roll out detections. And essentially, why I believe that's a key assumption is because red team's key functions is going to be that sparring partner with blue. To ensure that the detections and procedures that are in place are operating as effectively, and essentially help blue prepare for a real adversary. So my 10,000-foot view of red teaming, and there's a lot of little nuances that I won't really get into here, I'll just kind of keep it high level, which is that red teams essentially test the people, processes, and technology from an attacker's perspective. So you're helping drive improvements, being that sparring partner with detection and response. You're also assessing the state of security controls at different layers, and looking at attack paths and how attack paths can traverse security controls at different layers and what that looks like in the environment. But in my mind, like, effective red teams really drive positive change. So the environment gets harder, blue team gets increased ability for detection and response based on things that have been done, and also just a general increase in the awareness in an organization around security from an attacker's mindset. And so those are some things, like, my personal philosophy around internal red teams. But of course, like, how do we get there? Where do you start? If you were starting a new program, like, what would you do in your first year? And so these are some things we'll walk through here. But before we get there, just kind of wanted to go through some key skills that are at play when it comes to building out an internal red team function. And especially if you're starting new, it's a good chance you're going to be wearing different hats across different roles. So an example is, like, your planning or process development. So thinking in terms of how red team, what processes you need to put in place and how to plan out for your next 2 years. Operator skills is another one. So the ability to navigate a corporate environment, and what does that look like? And a lot of times for the operator skills, these even may differ from the skills you may use in a CTF. While you may utilize general pen testing skills on both, what's interesting on the red team side is you're looking at very different tech stacks than you approach in the CFP world or CTF world, where, like, you have a lot of integrated technologies, cloud, on-prem, a lot of things you deal with in the corporate environment that you may or may not necessarily come across in your CTFs. So just thinking, when I mention operator skills, just understanding how things fit together in modern corporate environments. Tool development is another key skill, just because, like, you may have a need for a certain type of tool to save you time or to effectively assess a application or an environment. Maybe that tool doesn't exist on GitHub, or you're not comfortable pulling it down, running it. So the ability to build your own. Infrastructure automation, the ability to stand up secure infrastructure quickly, so that if it gets burned in the course of a red team exercise, you can keep moving forward. Project management, like, that may or may not be inside of the red team, but the ability to drive things that red team is seeing over through to completion. So a lot of different things here that are at play. But I will say, one of the key skills I believe that may sometimes be overlooked is the soft skill of relationship building. And Wolfgang really highlighted on the importance of empathy in his talk. And that is, in my opinion, that's really important, because just being an effective red team, it takes an understanding of knowing, like, the challenges that blue team deals with, or that security engineering and architecture or cloud security, just kind of understanding the different challenges, limitations, and being able to sort of put yourself in their shoes and work together as a cohesive unit to move things forward. So another thing I wanted to do was sort of lay the foundation in terms of how you view your internal red team. So while red team is not necessarily like directly responsible for any of these teams, there's a lot of opportunity for red team to help these teams, and even vice versa. So an example might be, let's say you have a cloud security team in your organization, and cloud security has been seeing things systemically in the environment, and they've been trying to move the needle forward with preventions, getting things fixed, and they just haven't been able to move things forward as quickly as they like. So let's say you do a red team exercise, and part of that exercise, you assess cloud environment, and you find things, you find attack paths, you abuse them, and you have that as part of your attack chain. Now you can actually share that data over with the cloud security team, and now you provided them with evidence or muscle, as some would say, in order to help drive and move things forward. That's sort of how I like to view red team. Like, how can I lean into what other teams are dealing with and some challenges that they have, like, and it takes relationship building. And then hopefully as I craft my red team initiatives or exercises, I can make sure that I'm considering those inputs from other teams in my mind, so that then I can help them move forward things in the organization. And essentially what it comes down to is just really building a cohesive environment, especially within the security team at large, so that you're both, basically all teams are kind of helping each other move forward. Some other foundational things to think about if you're starting a new red team, corporate internal red team, is you may kind of deal with some preconceived notions that differ around what does an internal red team do. As I mentioned, there's really not a lot of standards here. So you may start a new red team, and one perspective may be, hey, we want you to do a lot of web application assessments, or another perspective may be, hey, we want you to do internal corporate fishing for metrics exercises, which Wolfgang talked about, right, in terms of like how that may not necessarily be the option you want to go. So just understanding that there's different perspectives, because red teams are still relatively new in terms of dedicated functions, and being able to have those discussions with your management chain, with other team members, to see what the expectations are and level set, so that for your environment, you know exactly how you all want to define and scope red teaming. Other things to consider for year one in my book is critical, because if you have a successful foundation, it's more likely that you'll have a longer runway for success. But again, like relationship building, especially with CERT, and just understanding where they are, what strategic initiatives they have in place, how you can help, and even use some of that for inputs into your purple team planning, which we'll talk about a little bit later. What processes and docs do you need to have in place? How do you show what impact you're having as an internal red team? Like, what types of assessments do you run? All those different things you kind of want to think about early as you start your red team, and you can then begin to kind of map it out along the way. And so now what I'll do is some recommendations about each quarter in the first year of your red team. So you'll see like Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. And these are just kind of recommendations from my experience of if you're starting a new red team function, things you might want to consider across each quarter in order to get things going in an effective manner. So first quarter, of course, relationship building, and I will say that a lot in this talk, because there's all like the technical aspect is well known, like the good technical skills to do red teaming, but sometimes I think the relationships part gets undersold in terms of understanding how valuable those are. And the reality is, even in most organizations today, relationships is how things move forward. Sometimes there's red tape or bureaucracy in order to kind of get things done, and sometimes just knowing the right person and you built rapport with them can really help kind of expedite and move things along a lot quicker. Other helpful documentation that you might want to have in your first quarter as a red team is your charter, and that's really like who you are, what you do, what your purpose and mission are, like what your key deliverables are, who your stakeholders are. You can have all that information in like a wiki in your organization, and have it available to everyone at the company, so that they can see that, hey, we have an internal red team, this is what they do, here's how to contact them. Another helpful document would be the rules of engagement, and that's really how you do what you do. And so essentially things like what's approved, what's kind of like in scope and out of scope, what is the deconfliction process look like? So if blue team finds activity that they suspect to be red, like what does that deconfliction process look like? Are you going to have a person who's in the know, like a white cell, and what does that process look like? Or even how do you get your red team exercises approved? Like all that stuff kind of fits into your rules of engagement. Other helpful documents that I think are good to have up front are your red team exercise proposal and your purple team exercise proposal. And I actually have a couple slides right after this where we'll look at examples for those. Last but not least, I highly recommend having a roadmap when you first start and plan 1 to 2 years out. And just thinking about, you can basically use your roadmap to identify where you are in terms of resources and capabilities, headcount, and where you want to go. Like what additional capabilities, how do you want to mature your exercises? So how do you want to look at things like supply chain attacks and how that might affect your company, or up-leveling your exercises to mimic higher level adversaries? How do you plan to work with threat intelligence to kind of incorporate emulation or simulation? And so those are some things to look at. And since I mentioned emulation and simulation, Tim Malcolm Vetter did a good job of sort of just explaining the difference between the two for where a lot of red teams are. And so emulation is typically where you mimic the exact tools, techniques, and procedures of an adversary that would be interested in targeting your environment. And simulation is more like you don't have a specific threat actor, but here, if it's basically saying if we were to look at an adversary with this type of capability, with this type of interest, and they were to target our organization, these are the tools, techniques, and procedures that they would use. So emulation and simulation, red teams may kind of switch between the two across their exercises, but essentially you want to identify and lay those out in your roadmap so you have a starting point and at least an initial vision for where you plan to go. So here's an example of a red team exercise assessment proposal that I have used myself and thought it was really straightforward, especially if you're just getting started for your red team program, first few assessments. And it's very basic, like it shows a description of the exercise, whether it's going to be outside in or soon breach, information on the scope. So if you're going to fish as part of it, how many people are you fishing? What organizations, maybe are you going to do a random selection for fishing or going to target organizations? Like all that stuff is good to put in here. What type of fish you're going to use if that's how you're going to run your exercise. Your dates, you can even break out things like attack phases by the date. And then that's helpful because there may be other things like change freezes or blackouts or financial reporting. And while in reality, an adversary is not limited by those things, the fact of the matter is if you're a new red team, like building trust is important, especially in that first year. And so there may be additional restraints that you put on yourself, like maybe you don't want to run an assessment around financials, or maybe you want to restrict the type of assessment you run on financials or during blackout periods, things like that. But as you build trust and you grow the program, eventually that will probably become less of a concern, but it's just something you may want to consider for a new program looking to build credibility. Also, you can list like your desired outcomes and what controls or detection and response you're going to test, even your resources. So like what tools you plan to use, and whether or not you're building anything custom. So this, just something as simple as this, you can get it up to your approvers. They can be in the know with exactly what you're doing, when you plan to do it, why you're planning to do it, etc. And essentially like have questions that you can go back and forth on and answer, and essentially make an approval decision. So this is an example of one that you could use for your exercises. For your purple team exercises, this is a template as well that I've used, and this one is more collaborative between red and blue, whereas the other template I just showed is more for like red and its management chain. And so here you're kind of working with blue to figure out what do we want to test and why do we want to test it, especially kind of letting blue sort of lead in that space at times to figure out like, hey, we have run books here that we really want to drill down on, or think we might be missing some detection gaps here, and crafting some purple team exercise scenarios around that. And that could be something as simple as like red and blue getting together for an hour or two in the same, like in a virtual room and just kind of knocking out the test. You can do it like kind of collaborating over Slack. There's like a lot of different ways you can actually do the purple team exercise. But in this case, just kind of looking at the template, you would also lay out your specific tests that you're going to run. So you could test by platform, indicate for each test whether it was prevented or detected. And I think this is important on the red team side for everything that you're running to make sure you know the things that blue could take and use as actionable indicators. So things like parent-child relationships, command line arguments, like something that blue can run with. Because it's one thing to come to blue and say, hey, I just ran a payload. It's like, well, outside of the file name, like what else do I have to look for? So I would say red can do some work up front there and sort of give blue more details that they can use to pivot and dig in their log sources. But essentially for this template, you're identifying your tests, the people involved, and who's going to do what for the purple team exercise. So some ground level, or continuing our foundation discussion for first quarter, I personally, this is just me, but I like to run a blind outside-in exercise before I become too biased. The reason being is, like, I know the longer I stay at a company, I'm going to start to learn things, especially working in security. I'm going to start to learn things that may taint like how I, decide to run an op. And for sometimes that is appropriate, like you want to use insider knowledge at certain points. But for this, my first quarter, I like to do a blind outside in, keep it very short in duration, like no more than a week, very tightly scoped with objectives, and using very low level TTPs, like maybe targeting the publicly facing login portal or simple fish for endpoint access and see if I can get keys or data from the endpoint and pivot somewhere else. Something very basic, but it helps you get a feel for the current state of detections and controls along a very basic attack path. And it also helps build that credibility for a new red team in the organization, because while purple teaming is definitely going to be integral to your first year, there's also this expectation that red team is going to also basically test and assess the controls in our environment as well and help uplift those. So that's just something I like to do, but you definitely want to make sure it works in your case and makes sense. For quarter two, I recommend unit testing or detection. So you can do MITRE ATT&CK, you can do the C2 matrix. Like those are really good starting points. Like the cool thing with ATT&CK is there's a lot of automated stuff like Red Canary out now that you can just have it like run through different phases of the attack for unit testing that you want to test for your endpoints, or even for cloud even. And then C2 Matrix is a good source because a lot of the commonly used command and control tools by red teams are already available in C2 Matrix. In fact, a couple of the command and control tools I've written are in C2 Matrix, which is truly a cool thing for me. But essentially, you want to gauge visibility, detection coverages, and gaps, and help build and improve high fidelity detections. For your initial purple team, you can, one other thing you can do is the red team exercise you ran in the first quarter, you can take the things you did that weren't detected, kind of break those into units and sort of replay those together with blue, where you can start working on things that you did that weren't detected and build detection or validate that logs are in place, etc. But essentially for quarter two, just continuing to build relationships and build out your internal red team docs and processes. Another thing I thought that Wolfgang pointed out, which I thought was really cool, was just the mindset and something that sort of conveys the mindset to have as you purple team in your environment, but just thinking about how can you complicate things for attackers, get them really frustrated to the point where they move on to something else. I know for me and the assessments or exercises that I've run, the more complicated the environment is, like it causes you to burn time, and usually nobody has an unlimited amount of time, right? There's usually an end goal or endpoint, so you want to complicate it and have attackers burn the clock and hopefully pivot and move on to somewhere else. And then on the flip side, when it comes to security controls, or even on the detection scene, I think it's also applicable, but simplifying things and making sure you're not putting like over overburdening your people with unnecessary things, but empowering them while also securing it. So I thought that was really good perspective for Wolfgang to keep in mind. For quarter 3, I recommend like continuing your unit testing. So whether it's MITRE ATT&CK or C2 matrix, like continue along that road and get your coverage there. I also like to do another tightly scoped red team exercise. This can be outside in or assume breach, but just making sure your objectives are impactful from a data perspective, what you're going after, no more than 1 week in duration. And so you have, I guess just to recap, with this approach, like the first quarter, you would have run your initial tightly scoped red team exercise. The second quarter, you would have done a lot more purple teaming, unit testing. Then in the third quarter, you're doing another red team exercise that's tightly scoped. And then you're also building relationships, and you're continuing to share what you're up to on the red team with other teams, such as Intel Insider Threat, cloud security, like any other teams within the security umbrella, and even outside of the security umbrella. I think one thing that's been cool that I have been able to do before is being able to speak at other teams' all hands meetings that are not even security teams, and just saying, hey, we're a red team, here's what we do, here's how to get in touch with us, this is the kind of workflow we have, are there any questions, and just sort of getting the name out and the word out across both security and non-security teams. And then in Q4, you're actually wrapping up the year now, and it's time to start demonstrating the impact that you've had for year 1. So things like what has the red team actually helped drive? Are there new high fidelity detections, new runbooks, new security controls that we can highlight? How has the red team sort of leaned into other strategic initiatives in order and basically helped other teams move things across the line for security that they've been trying to do? Again, the knowledge sharing, brown bags, etc. Those are things you can highlight to demonstrate impact. And also, this in quarter 4 would be a good time to basically refine your roadmap for year 2. So you started it at the beginning of the year. Now you can refine it since you've sort of been doing it for almost a year, and think about additional capabilities. If you need headcount, here's a good chance to not just say you need headcount, but why and what won't get done if you don't have additional headcount. And even demonstrate before you get headcount approval that you already have work slated out for each person. Just makes the process a lot smoother, and it shows management that you've done your due diligence and planning and preparing for the upcoming year on red team. So some additional guidelines and approaches for red team exercises themselves. I like to think in terms of like business versus tech, even though you do need to know tech as well. But I like to think more data-driven versus system-driven. So like accessing a system is only important really because of the data that it contains. And so thinking about things from an executive's perspective, like why would they care? And what I found is a lot of times stories tend to resonate. Basically telling a story of what you did, why you did it, how you did it, started here, which led, I gained access here, which then I was able to pivot here. Here are my recommendations, etc. Just really clean cut, a direct path. And I think it's also important to identify like what made your attack harder. So what controls worked, and that's a good way to give credit to the teams that have invested in security and let them know that what you've done has been effective, or at least it slowed me down. Also identify areas for that detection and response did well in. I think that's important because a lot of times the tendency is to focus on what was missed, but it's also good to call out what was not missed and what was done well. And then of course you can identify additional opportunities for betterments around controls or response. A key thing I'd say is really know your organization. So in the red team space, it's common that our debrief reports are very long and detailed, and which is great, but just make sure that that resonates in your environment. So if you're at an organization that likes that kind of stuff, by all means. But the companies I've worked for tend to like very succinct, straight to the point, like presentations that tell a story. And so I typically tend to use PowerPoints that basically get right to the point and show the attack path, like the evidence of access, and then the recommendations going forward. So just something to think about. Next, I'm going to quickly talk about some approaches to red team exercises themselves. I did a blog post on this based on things I've experienced and others in the industry. So 4 different approaches that I've seen to red team exercises. First one, your long running exercise. So a lot of planning and preparation up front, usually involves emulating a very high level adversary, and it's from the outside in. The goal is to gain access and to retain access without being detected in order to like access data, live in the environment, and route to meeting your mission or objectives. And so usually this assessment, there'll be multiple avenues in with the assumption that at some point one of those will get burned. But I will say this is a great North Star to have. But most organizations, especially new red teams, we're probably not going to be doing a long running exercise for the first year or two at least. Because this is better suited for organizations with very large and mature blue and red teams where a lot of the basics have been covered, like unit testing, your detections, etc. And even on the red team side, it requires a considerable amount of resources to emulate a very high level threat actor. But this is a good North Star to have. Another approach is what I call linear exercises. And essentially what this is some approach that you see that some adversaries will use is they'll use the exact same thing in terms of tools, techniques, and procedures until that thing no longer works. And then they'll level up and they'll keep it there until that no longer works. And you kind of see that here in the chart where the lightning bolts represent the red team exercises. And like the first one here, you ran an exercise, you weren't stopped. So you basically, the second exercise, you do almost the exact same thing. This time you're stopped. So for your third exercise, you level up. And this is an interesting approach. I would not recommend like having all your ops follow linear approach because you'll be kind of limited in your adversary profile and your tools, techniques, and procedures. But it might be interesting to have maybe 2 or 3 exercises kind of look like this and just see how that works in your environment. One thing I do like about this approach is it does sort of emphasize closing out the detection and response and security controls because you know the same thing's coming back again. And so if you want something, you know, you want to see a different technique, you kind of have to close out what's currently being used. Another approach is non-linear, so the opposite of that, where you run different exercises that are really have no relationship to any of the others, and there's different threat actor profiles, etc. And what's neat about this approach is it helps blue teams see a variety of different tools, techniques, and procedures. One thing to be careful about though is you just don't want to get the shiny object effect where it's like, ooh, this new attack path's out, let's run it. Ooh, another one, let's run that. And while it's great to give blue and the organization exposure to a lot of this stuff, just make sure you have time to close out things like your detections and responses, your security preventions, your procedures, like make sure all that stuff can be closed out before you move on to the next. Then of course you have unit testing. So this is, I won't spend too much time here because we've already covered this, but this is where, for example, using the MITRE attack matrix and getting your coverage across platforms to at least detect base, like base TTPs. But one area that red teams can really lean in here is sometimes we know other ways of accomplishing those same tactics that may not necessarily be in the attack matrix. So we can introduce those during our tests, and we can also provide those as feedback to MITRE to add them into future iterations of the attack matrix. So opportunity there as well. So as you're planning your roadmap, just things to think about for your exercises. I recommend a mixture of linear and nonlinear, and ensuring that you continue your unit testing coverage by platform and OS. And make sure you stick to whatever frequency or cadence that works for you. I personally like running quarterly red team exercises because I feel like that's enough time if it's a short scoped exercise to like find an impactful attack path, do the out briefs, kind of close things out, fix the remediations, and then kind of move into the next one. But you have to make sure whatever cadence you pick works for your environment. And then of course for your roadmap, like making sure you're watching out for areas that you can grow as a red team. So what skill set gaps do you have? Collaborative exercises, that's a big one, like letting other teams jump in and help during red teams. Like that's a great way to build relationships across the organization. Identifying any peanut butter effect where maybe some other things that are slowing you down that are not necessarily primary red team things, like being able to identify those, identify some solutions and how to move forward So here's an example of a red team workflow throughout the year that I've used before. Again, just an example, but I like quarterly red team exercises, whether it's outside in or soon breach, along with a quarterly purple team exercise. And then even running like twice a year, maybe some specific assessment, and it could be like somebody asks, or blue team or security engineering comes and says, hey, we're rolling out a new EDR product. We want red team to help kick the tires on it. Or, hey, we need help with segmentation testing. We rolled out controls that should properly segregate these environments. While those necessarily may not fall under the quote unquote red team umbrella, those still may be opportunities, especially for a new red team, for you to lean in and help other teams with some of their initiatives. I also like dedicated research and development time. So I like to do at least 1 to 2 weeks a quarter where I can build new capabilities, do research on techniques, do my infrastructure automation so I can be more nimble. And also like helping with the CERT tabletop exercise. So providing an attacker's lens on whatever scenario that you're crafting for the exercise. So these are just some examples of a workflow that you could use for a new red team. Next, I'll jump through some metrics. I also did a blog post here on some helpful metrics specific to red team exercises. First one, dwell time. And for me, I define dwell time as the time from when red team gets initial access to when they're booted. Time to initial access. So the time from when you start the exercise to when you get initial access. That one's pretty interesting because it may even show like some of the controls and how effective they are in terms of making it difficult to get that initial access point. Time to detection. So your initial access time, how long is that from when blue first sees you? Or even how long, like where in the kill chain are you being detected? Time to remediation, like from when blue first detects you, how long does it take them to remediate you? Those are just some examples, and there's other ways you can slice the metrics, but I think these are really cool and very specific to exercises and allows you to track, at least with some level of consistency across exercises, how things are trending. I know truth of the matter is it may be difficult to do that across various exercises when like there may be different visibility issues in different environments, but it's still something I think you can work towards. And it's very collaborative. It forces blue and red to work together because neither side has the whole picture. So something to keep in mind. These metrics can also help with the storytelling in terms of answering things like how effective are the remediation processes, how is blue team trending across exercises, are things getting harder for red team over time? How are we shifting detections earlier? So just something to keep in mind if you're thinking about like impactful metrics for an internal red team. So some things, just wrapping it up around lessons learned. Flexibility, I would say, is key when you're starting a red team function. You may not do red team things all the time. Like you may get pulled into other things, and that's okay. Just make sure you're able to document what the impact of other things you're getting pulled into is on your primary objectives, and map a way forward. Like maybe you can automate something and give it off to an appropriate team. Foster open sharing. I'm big on like just being an open book, not only with blue team around your tactics you're using, but just in general to other members of security or even to the organization around who the red team is and what we're doing. I think that just helps raise security awareness. Also, if you do not have a vision for red team, then someone else will. So take time up front to think broadly about the program and like beyond just the technical aspects of like the hacking piece. Think of it as a program and where you plan to take the program. Fail forward. So like I've tried things with purple team exercises that didn't work very well, and so that was a chance to go back and tweak it and try again. So just keep trying things until something works in your environment. Blue team being successful is a great thing, and that's the end goal of what we're going for. So if blue stops an attack path or security prevention stop an attack path, that's awesome. Like that's what we want to call out and make sure like we give praise to those teams or to those efforts that have made the attack path harder. Clear, concise reporting, just making sure that your reporting is telling a story and it's telling it in a way that resonates with upper management. I think that's important and helps convey like the why of your red team exercise. And of course, relationship building, and can't stress empathy enough, just understanding the challenges that other teams are dealing with and leaning into the best of your ability to help them. get things over the fence, or like taking your outputs and seeing how you can help them and how they can help you. So putting it all together, the ground level, again, relationships, your team charter, your basic documents you want to have in place up front, some things to think about around your exercise, your red team exercises. Use both linear and nonlinear options, and keep long running op as your North Star that you can sort of mature and work towards. Keep a cadence that you can stick to and that makes sense for your environment. Again, just make sure you can track meaningful metrics that will help tell your story, and fail forward. Like, don't be afraid to make mistakes. That's how we all learn, and continue to openly share with other teams. So these are some references of some of my blog posts here that back up some of more information on some of the things I talked about here. I also recommend checking out Wolfgang's Design Thinking for Blue Teams talk, which was right before mine. Really good stuff in there. Again, this is just my lens from my experience. There's other blogs out on corporate red teams as well, like Tim Malcolm Vetter, Red Team Journal. It's all sorts of different things out there that you can read on as additional resources as well. So thank you all for listening, for taking the time, and I'll be hanging out in the Discord channel afterwards for any questions, so feel free to reach out.
I was taking screenshots of that one.
I have some questions. Perry might have some questions too. Bryson has no questions.
Dave, go ahead.
All right, so first of all, I can't help but notice the red teamer in your jiu-jitsu photo was the one getting armbarred, and I do not think that's representative. So I'm going to request the next presentation has that swapped out. But my real question is, one thing that struck me in the initial portion of the presentation, when you were talking about developing partnerships with other organizations within the company, is one of the ones was obviously incident response. Now, I will say that in a million years of doing this, since I'm as old as the hills, I have very rarely seen an organization be willing to share like the incident response information, which is sometimes very sensitive, with their red team organization. Have you encountered success with linking these two parts of the system?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I can say that at least in one of the organizations I've worked in, that has been the case, and mainly like CERT would share their incident response plans for feedback or even input into like a purple team exercise. And so say, hey, like this is our run book, this is how we handle, I don't know, I'm just gonna say malware, like a host malware infection as an example. And a chance to kind of look at it, see what CERT does, and then in our purple team exercise, we can actually run through it and see if that run book makes sense, or is there any gaps, things we want to do to improve it. So I would say yes, I have experienced that, but it kind of depends on the organization, because like sometimes there is more of an adversarial mindset between red and blue. But I guess for me personally, I'm more along the lines of open sharing, even on the attacker side. Like even if something has not been fixed, rather than trying to hide it and reuse it again, from a red team perspective, I think it's more beneficial to just share it with blue. And like, here's how the attack works underneath the hood. Here's everything you need to know about it that I know. I just think it's just a better approach to sort of uplifting the environment.
I was really struck by the emphasis on collaboration and empathy. As someone pointed out in the chat, there is a notable theme to all of these talks, namely empathy. I would ask some questions, but we're about ready for our next presenter. Dave, would you like to introduce him?
Oh, yes, I would like to introduce him. I actually prepared a special, let's bring him in.
Did
Hold
I
on.
put you on the spot there?
No, I actually prepared, but I don't see him. He needs
No,
to.
Thank you so much, Cedric.
Yep, there we go.
Thank you.
That was really wonderful. I learned quite a lot actually.
So,
Thank you.
안녕하세요, 잼씨. I'm attempting to speak Korean to him.